Second chances rarely arrive with flashing lights or a choir of angels. Sometimes they slip through the cracks of a mundane Tuesday, smelling of burnt diner coffee and cheap vinyl. When he slid into the booth opposite me, twisting his features into that familiar, guilt-laced expression, to end our relationship, he expected tears. He was waiting for the begging. Instead, armed with the bruising memories of a ruined future, a smile cracked my lips. Let me show you how walking away changes everything. Grease coated the roof of my mouth, a thick, slick reminder of the stale diner fries I hadn't realized I was chewing. The linoleum beneath my scuffed boots vibrated slightly, carrying the low mechanical rattle of the refrigerator unit behind the pie counter. Hannah, are you even listening to me? The voice was a physical strike. It pulled me out of a dark, suffocating void and dropped me directly into the harsh fluorescent glare of Denny's on 4th Street. My lungs expanded violently. I sucked in air that tasted of bleached countertops and burnt onions. I blinked and the blurred edges of the world sharpened into terrifying focus. Clifford sat across from me. He was leaning forward, his forearms resting on the sticky table. He wore the faded green flannel shirt I had bought him for his birthday. Clear as throat, the one that, in a timeline I somehow remembered living, he would eventually leave at another woman's apartment. His brown hair fell over his forehead, just the way he practiced in the mirror to make it look effortless. My fingers gripped the edge of the table. The laminate was peeling at the corner, rough and sharp against my thumb. It was real. The dull ache in my lower back, a constant companion in my late 30s, was completely gone. The phantom weight of a decade of misery, debt, and chronic exhaustion had evaporated. I was 24 again. Hannah Clifford, said his voice, dropping into that quiet, patronizing register he reserved for delivering bad news. I just don't think we're growing in the same direction anymore. A bizarre, bubbling sensation started in my stomach. It wasn't panic. Panic was what I had felt the first time this happened. In the original version of this nightmare, my chest had caved in. I had knocked my water glass over, sobbing so loudly the waitress had to ask us to quiet down. I had grabbed his hands, begging him to tell me what I did wrong, offering to change, offering to pay his half of the rent, offering to erase my own spine just to keep him around. This time I just stared at his mouth. I noticed the slight asymmetry of his bottom lip. I noticed the tiny bead of sweat at his temple. He was nervous, not because he was breaking my heart, but because he was terrified of a public scene. It's not you, he continued, eyes darting toward the kitchen doors as if looking for an escape route. You're amazing. You are. But I need space. I need to figure out who I am without us. We should see other people. He exhaled slowly, sinking back against the red vinyl booth. He had delivered his lines. Now he braced himself for the explosion. My heart hammered against my ribs, an erratic thumping rhythm. My brain was still trying to reconcile the memory of dying alone in a sterile hospital room with the reality of the sticky diner table. The sheer absurdity of it all collided with the pathetic rehearsed script coming out of his mouth. A muscle in my cheek twitched. I tried to suppress it, but the pressure in my chest was too immense. It bubbled up my throat, scratching against my vocal cords. I smiled. It wasn't a triumphant, cinematic smirk. It felt rusty, my facial muscles stretching awkwardly, as if they had forgotten how to form the expression. It was a raw, slightly unhinged pulling of my lips. It felt entirely out of my control, but once it started, I couldn't stop it. Clifford's eyebrows slammed together. The relief he had been seconds away from feeling was instantly derailed. Are you smiling? Yes, I said. My voice cracked slightly. I cleared my throat, forcing the pitch down. Okay. He repeated his head, tilting a fraction of an inch to the left. The neon sign outside buzzed loudly through the silence that followed. What do you mean? Okay, I agree, I said. I picked up my paper napkin, methodically, folding it in half, then into quarters, focusing on the rough texture of the cheap paper. We shouldn't be together. You need space. I completely agree. His jaw worked slightly. He looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking Russian. This wasn't the script. I was supposed to be the anchor holding him back, the hysterical girlfriend he had outgrown. My easy agreement didn't make him feel free. It made him feel irrelevant. Just like that, his tone sharpened a defensive edge, cutting through the faux, gentle breakup voice. For years, Hannah, and you're just okay with it. The contradiction in his ego was almost tragic. He wanted to leave, but he desperately needed me to want him to stay. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $5 bill. I smoothed it out on the table, right next to the empty coffee mug. My coffee was $3. Keep the change for the tip. My legs felt slightly numb as I slid out of the booth, but they held my weight. I stood up, grabbing my coat from the hook. I didn't look at him again. I didn't wait for his permission to end the conversation. Hannah, wait. I pushed the heavy glass door of the diner open. The brass bell above it chimed a bright, sharp sound that cut through the stale air. I stepped out onto the pavement, the door swinging shut behind me, sealing Clifford and the ghost of my former pathetic self inside forever. Footsteps echoed sharply against the damp concrete. The evening air carried the distinct metallic scent of impending rain, mixed with the exhaust fumes of city traffic. I walked fast, my boots splashing through shallow puddles, reflecting the sickly orange glow of the street lamps. I was waiting for the breakdown. I was waiting for the moment the adrenaline would crash and the reality of losing the man I had built my entire 20s around would paralyze me. It didn't happen. Instead, a strange, hollow lightness expanded in my chest. I stopped at a crosswalk, leaning against the cold metal pole of the traffic light, and pressed my palm against my sternum. The heartbeat beneath my ribs was steady. No crushing anxiety, no breathlessness. In my previous life, the walk home from the diner had been a blur of hyperventilation and denial. I had called him 11 times before I even reached my front door. I had spent the next 3 years trying to win him back, compromising my career, alienating my friends, and draining my savings to prove I was worthy of his half-hearted affection. I crossed the street, the rubber soles of my boots gripping the asphalt. My apartment building loomed at the end of the block, a brutalist brick structure that always smelled vaguely of boiled cabbage and floor wax. My hand trembled slightly as I dug my keys out of my pocket. The metal edges dug into my palm, grounding me. I found the silver key with the square head, the one that stuck in the lock if you didn't pull it toward you while turning. The familiar rhythmic click of the deadbolt, sliding back, sent a shiver down my spine. I pushed the door open. The studio was suffocatingly small. The single window overlooked an alleyway, letting in only the anemic light of a neighboring building's security floodlight. The air was stale, laced with the cheap lavender room spray I used to buy in bulk. I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. The clatter was deafening in the quiet room. Walking over to the narrow bathroom, I flicked the light switch. The fluorescent bulb flickered twice before buzzing to life. I leaned over the sink, my hands gripping the faux marble edges, and stared into the mirror. I expected to see the hollowed out, exhausted 34-year-old woman who had just died. Instead, a face completely untouched by a decade of grief stared back at me. My skin was fuller, lacking the sharp, gaunt lines that stress would eventually carve into my cheeks. The dark circles under my eyes were entirely manageable. My hair dyed a harsh ink-black color that I had mistakenly thought gave me an edge fell in heavy waves around my shoulders. I reached up, pressing my fingertips against my cheekbone. The skin was warm, real. I laughed. It started as a low, dry sound in the back of my throat and escalated into a short, cynical bark. It was the laugh of someone who had just survived a car crash by inches. I stepped back from the mirror and walked into the main room. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. The screen cracked diagonally across the top, right corner, illuminated the dark room. Clifford, one new message. What the hell just happened? Are you okay? You're acting crazy. I stared at the glowing pixels. A phantom pang of the old devotion twitched somewhere in my gut. The ingrained Pavlovian urge to text back immediately, to apologize, to smooth things over. It was muscle memory, a reflex built from years of walking on eggshells. I took a slow breath, letting the smell of cheap lavender fill my lungs. I swiped the notification away, navigated to his contact, and tapped Do Not Disturb. I didn't block him. Not yet. Blocking him would tell him I was hurt. Blocking him was an action born of emotion. Silence, pure and unbothered, was an absolute void. I tossed the phone onto the unmade bed, kicked off my boots, and fell back onto the mattress. The springs groaned beneath me, staring up at the water stain on the ceiling, a stain shaped remarkably like a bruised eye. I realized the absolute, terrifying freedom of my situation. I had nothing to lose because I had already lost it once. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't dread waking up the next day. Morning came with the harsh, unforgiving light of a clear sky slicing through the gap in my cheap blinds. I woke up with a jolt, my hand instinctively grasping the sheets. I expected the stiff, sterile feeling of hospital linens. Instead, my fingers curled into my own worn cotton duvet. The digital clock on the bedside table glared back at me in red blocky numbers. 6:30 a.m. I, clear as throat, swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards creaked. I walked to the tiny kitchen area and turned on the coffee maker. It spat and gurgled, filling the apartment with the bitter, acidic smell of cheap grounds. Today was Wednesday. In the old timeline, today was the day I went to work with puffy, bloodshot eyes, locked myself in the bathroom stall every hour to cry, and made the structural error on the Peterson blueprint that would ultimately cost me my job 3 weeks later. I dressed with mechanical efficiency. I bypassed the oversized, comfortable sweaters I usually hid in opting instead for a tailored blazer and a pair of dark trousers I kept for client meetings. If I was going to rewrite my life, I wasn't going to do it looking like a casualty. The subway ride was a sensory assault. The metallic screech of the brakes, the damp heat of too many bodies, pressed together the smell of wet wool and stale cologne. It all felt incredibly vivid, hyper-real. I clung to the overhead rail, feeling the vibration of the train rattle through my arm. When I stepped into the office of Kensington Architecture and Design, the air was thick with the smell of ozone from the massive plot printers and stale carpet. The low murmur of phones ringing and keyboards clacking washed over me. Hannah! The voice was bright, overly sweet, and laced with an underlying current of eager anticipation. I turned. Nev was speedo walking toward me, holding 2 paper cups of overpriced latte. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a perfect, messy bun, and she wore a soft cream-colored cashmere sweater. Nev Brown, my best friend at the firm, the woman whose shoulder I had cried on for months, the woman who I later found out had been texting Clifford details of my breakdowns, slowly weaving herself into his life as the rational, calm alternative to my hysteria. "Hey," and I said. My voice was completely flat. She paused, her perfectly glossed lips parting in slight confusion at my tone. She recovered quickly, holding out one of the cups. "I brought you a vanilla latte. You left the office in such a rush yesterday, and you weren't answering your phone last night. Is everything okay with you and Clifford?" She tilted her head, her eyes wide, with manufactured empathy. She was hunting for information. She already knew he was breaking up with me. She had likely helped him script it. Now, she wanted the gory details of the execution. I took the cup. The paper was warm against my palm. "Thanks for the coffee," I said, taking a sip. "It was too sweet. Everything is fine. Clifford and I broke up." Nina gasped, her hand flying to her chest. It was an impressive performance. "Oh my God. Hannah, what? When? Why didn't you call me? Are you devastated? We need to get drinks tonight. You need to vent." "I'm really not," I said, stepping past her toward my desk. It was a long time coming. Honestly, it's a relief. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back to see the micro expressions of confusion and panic I knew were flashing across her face. By depriving her of my grief, I was depriving her of her leverage. I sat down at my desk, booted up my dual monitors, and pulled up the CAD files for the Peterson project. The harsh blue light of the screens washed over my face. I clicked through the structural layers until I found it. the load-bearing column on the third floor that I had originally miscalculated by a crucial half-inch. It was a mistake that would have compromised the entire south-facing glass wall. My hand moved the mouse with steady precision. I deleted the error, adjusted the calculation, and saved the file. Just like that, a disaster was erased. The day dragged on. I worked with a focus I hadn't possessed in years. NEI tried to approach me twice more, but I kept my eyes glued to my screens, offering only monosyllabic answers until she retreated, frustrated. At 5:15 p.m., I packed my bag, slung my coat over my arm, and took the elevator down to the lobby. The glass doors of the building slid open, letting in the cool evening air. And there he was. Clifford was leaning against the stone facade of the building, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He looked exhausted. His hair was ruffled, not in the practiced way, but as if he had been running his hands through it all day. When he saw me, he pushed off the wall and walked toward me, his jaw set in a hard line. He smelled like nervous sweat and strong cologne. "You ignored my texts," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I was working. I replied, my tone conversational, as if commenting on the weather. I didn't stop walking. I maintained my pace toward the subway station, forcing him to fall into step beside me if he wanted to talk. You don't just walk out of a 4-year relationship and then go radio silent. He snapped his breathing, slightly heavier as he struggled to keep up with my brisk pace. "We need to have a proper conversation. Hannah, you acted like a sociopath yesterday." I stopped abruptly. The sudden halt made him take 2 extra steps before he caught himself and turned back to me. "A proper conversation?" I asked, looking directly into his eyes. There was no anger in my chest, only a deep, abiding exhaustion with the man standing in front of me. "Clifford, you dumped me in a Denny's. You said your piece. I agreed with you, and I left. You got exactly what you wanted. You're free." I wanted closure. He shot back his voice, rising enough to draw a brief glance from a passing commuter. "No," I said softly, the corners of my mouth twitching upward in a sad, cynical smile. "You want an audience. You wanted to feel guilty, because feeling guilty means you matter. But you don't. Not anymore." I watched the color drain from his face, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. I didn't wait for his response. I turned on my heel, the sound of my boots sharp against the pavement, and walked down the subway stairs, leaving him completely alone on the sidewalk. Morning traffic vibrated against the thin glass of my studio window, a low, constant hum that rattled the loose frame. Sunlight filtered through layers of city smog, painted pale, sickly yellow stripes across my blanket. My mouth tasted of stale sleep and the metallic tang of adrenaline that still hadn't fully dissipated from the night before. Throwing the covers aside, the sudden drop in temperature raised goose bumps along my arms. I didn't reach for my phone to check for Clifford's texts. Instead, I grabbed my laptop from the floor, the cold aluminum shell shocking my bare thighs as I sat cross-legged on the mattress. The fan roared to life a desperate wheezing sound, fingers flying across the keys. I logged into my banking portal, in the timeline that felt like a past life. This was the week Clifford convinced me to move my holiday bonus into our joint savings. It was supposed to be the seed money for a down payment on a townhouse in the suburbs. 2 years later, he would drain it to fund a doomed artisanal brewing venture with a friend, leaving me to cover our rent on credit cards. The screen loaded, displaying the modest balance. $5. For 100 to the old me. It was our future. To the current me, it was a lifeline. I clicked transfer. The plastic mouse button snapped under my index finger. I routed every single cent of my contributions, leaving his meager $300 untouched into a newly opened individual account. A tiny green check mark appeared. Transaction successful. A heavy knot behind my sternum, when I hadn't even realized was tied, suddenly dissolved. My chest rose and fell in a long, shuddering breath. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, reflecting my own tired but uncharacteristically calm eyes. The air in the office later that morning tasted of burnt espresso and ozone from the copy machines. My heels sank slightly into the industrial gray carpet as I navigated the maze of cubicles. Hannah, my office, now Arthur Pendleton, stood in the doorway of his glass-walled sanctuary, clutching a rolled-up blueprint. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles, a pointed nose, a jutting chin, and shoulders perpetually hitched up to his ears from stress. He smelled strongly of peppermint breath mints and expensive dry cleaning. I changed my trajectory, feeling the weight of several stairs, tracking my movement. The most intense glare came from Nai's desk. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, her eyes wide, waiting to see if I was about to be fired. In my previous existence, I had been called into Arthur's office a month from now, weeping as he pointed out the structural flaw in the Peterson project. I stepped onto the hardwood floor of his office. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the hum of the bullpen. Arthur unrolled the thick paper across his desk, slapping a paperweight onto one corner. Who authorized you to alter the load-bearing calculations on the third-floor atrium? His voice was a growly bark. I stepped closer to the desk, pressing my fingertips against the smooth mahogany edge. Nobody, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the terror that used to paralyze me in his presence. I was reviewing the CAD files yesterday and caught a half-indiscrepancy in the steel column specs. If we proceeded with the original numbers, the stress on the south-facing glass would have caused microfractures within a year of settling. I corrected the math and updated the file. Arthur leaned heavily on his knuckles, his pale eyes scanning the blueprint. The silence stretched, the rhythmic ticking of his antique grandfather clock in the corner hammered against my drums. My stomach did a slow, uncomfortable flip, a residual fear response, fighting against my logical certainty. A half inch, he muttered, tracing a line with a manicured fingernail. He pulled a red pen from his pocket, hovered it over the paper, and then slowly put it back. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Frankly, Rogers, the senior engineers, missed this. It would have been a multi-million-dollar liability. I know, I said simply. Arthur straightened up, adjusting his silk tie. The aggressive posture evaporated, replaced by a calculating professional appraisal. Good catch. Extremely good catch. The Peterson reps are coming in tomorrow. I want you in the meeting. You know the structural math better than the seniors right now. And I want you there to explain the reinforcement strategy. Understood. I gave a short nod, suppressing the dizzying rush of vertigo. I wasn't just surviving this new reality. I was actively rewriting the script. When I stepped back out into the bullpen, Nvi was already out of her chair, intercepting me by the water cooler. The heavy, sweet smell of her vanilla perfume was suffocating. Oh my God, Hannah, are you okay? She whispered loudly, gripping my forearm. Her nails dug slightly into my blazer. Was he yelling at you? Do you need to go to the bathroom and take a minute? I can cover for you. I looked down at her hand on my arm. The contrast was stark. Her desperate need to manufacture a crisis against my total lack of one. I am perfectly fine, Nivea, I said gently but firmly, prying her fingers off my sleeve. ARR just wanted me to join the Peterson pitch tomorrow. Nivea's perfectly sculpted eyebrows froze. The carefully constructed mask of pity fractured, revealing a sharp, ugly flash of pure envy. You? But you're a junior drafter. Why would he put you in a client meeting? Because I fixed a problem, I said. I grabbed a paper cup, filled it with water, and took a slow sip. The chilled liquid grounded me. I looked her dead in the eye. Is there anything else you need? Net, I have a lot to prep. Her mouth open then closed. She took a step back, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if looking for someone to witness my erratic behavior. No, I guess not. You're just acting really weird today. I'm just working, I replied, tossing the cup into the trash. See you at your desk. Walking away from her felt better than the bank transfer. It was the physical sensation of cutting a parasite loose. Cardboard fibers scratched against my fingernails as I dragged another empty box from the stack in the corner. Saturday afternoon. Sunlight baked the dust mows, dancing in the air of my apartment. The television was unmuted, displaying a meaningless cooking show, just to break the suffocating silence. I held Clifford's favorite oversized gray hoodie. It smelled intensely of his cedarwood deodorant and the slightly sour scent of sweat. My stomach lurched, a sudden, violent wave of nausea hitting me so hard I had to grip the back of a dining chair. It wasn't heartbreak. It was profound, visceral disgust. In the timeline, I remember this hoodie had been my security blanket. I had slept in it for a week straight after he left, breathing in his scent, crying until my eyelids were swollen shut. Now, holding the cheap cotton fabric, I felt the phantom weight of those wasted years pressing down on my chest. I tossed it into the box with the rest of his video games, half-empty cologne bottles, and the pretentious philosophy books he bought, but never actually read. The metallic scrape of a key sliding into the front door deadbolt shattered the quiet. My head snapped up. The lock turned with a heavy clunk. Clifford pushed the door open, his shoulder bumping against the doorframe. He was holding a plastic bag that reeked intensely of fish sauce, roasted peanuts, and lime, the pad thai from the place on 8th Street. Our place. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him with his heel. He wore a practiced, melancholic smile designed to convey deep emotional turmoil, mixed with gentle concern. It was a performance crafted for an audience of one. "Hey," he said softly, holding up the plastic bag. "I know things ended weirdly the other night. I figured neither of us probably wanted to cook, and we have a lot to talk about. We need to figure out how to navigate this." He walked further into the room, stopping dead when he noticed the 3 large taped-up cardboard boxes stacked neatly by the coat rack. His eyes darted from the boxes to the packing tape in my hand and finally to my face. "What is this?" His voice lost its soft, practiced edge, pitching up in genuine confusion. "Your things," I said. I set the tape dispenser down on the table. The plastic clattered loudly against the wood. "I was going to text you to come get them tomorrow, but since you're here, you can take them now." Clifford stared at me, his jaw slackening. He looked at the plastic bag in his hand, then back to the boxes, his brain violently rejecting the data it was receiving. He had come here expecting a tearful reunion, a messy conversation where he could play the gracious boundaries, setting X while I pleaded for scraps of his time. He thought he could downgrade me from girlfriend to emotional safety net over a plate of noodles. "Hannah, be serious," he scoffed, walking over to the small kitchen counter and dropping the bag onto it. The containers inside slapped together. "You boxed up all my stuff in 3 days. You're acting unhinged. This is exactly why we need to talk. You're completely shutting down." I walked over to the counter. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My heart rate remained incredibly powerfully steady. I reached out my fingers, wrapping around the plastic handles of the takeout bag, and slid it back across the laminate toward him. "Take your food, Clifford. I'm not leaving until we talk about this," he said, stepping closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. The smell of his cedarwood deodorant was overpowering, mixing sickeningly with the fish sauce. "You're throwing away 4 years without a single tear. It's creepy, Hannah. Honestly, it makes me think you never even cared about me." The audacity was breathtaking. The sheer narcissistic gravity of his worldview demanded that my existence revolve entirely around his emotional state. I let out a short, hollow laugh. It scraped against my throat. "You broke up with me. You sat in a diner, told me you wanted to see other people, and asked for space. I am giving you exactly what you asked for. The fact that my compliance offends you is a problem for your therapist, not for me." His face flushed, dark red, a vein pulsing faintly at his temple. "So that's it. You're just a cold now." The insult, which would have historically sent me into an apologetic spiral, landed with the weight of a dried leaf. I felt nothing but a dull, ringing exhaustion. "Put your key on the counter," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Hannah, put the key on the counter. Pick up your boxes and get out of my apartment." He stared at me, his chest heaving. He was searching my face for a crack, a sign of weakness, a glimmer of the desperate girl he used to control. He found absolutely nothing. It was like looking at a stranger, swearing under his breath. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver key, and slammed it down onto the counter. The metal clanged sharply, He grabbed the plastic bag, marched over to the door, and hoisted the top two boxes into his arms. He struggled with the weight, his face twisting in indignity. "You're going to regret this when you calm down." He spat over his shoulder, his voice trembling with bruised ego. "Don't forget the last box," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms over my chest. He didn't respond. He kicked the door open awkwardly, maneuvering the boxes into the hallway, and let the heavy wood slam shut behind him. The impact rattled the picture frames on the wall. The silence that rushed in to fill the apartment was deafening. The smell of peanuts and fish sauce lingered in the stale air. I walked over to the door, my legs suddenly feeling like lead, and through the deadbolt, I slid the chain into place. I pressed my forehead against the cool, painted wood of the door. Closing my eyes, a violent tremor ripped through my hands. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, jagged gasp as the ghost of my old trauma violently collided with my new reality. My brain was screaming that I had made a mistake, that I was alone, that I would die alone. The panic response was chemically ingrained, a neurological pathway carved deep by years of emotional abuse. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I dug my fingernails into my forearms, focusing on the sharp, stinging pain. It's a phantom limb. I told myself the relationship is dead. The fear is just a reflex. I sat on the scuffed floorboards for 20 minutes, listening to the erratic thumping of my own heart. Slowly, gradually returned to a steady rhythm. When I finally stood up, my knees popped and the air in the apartment felt just a little bit lighter. Fluorescent bulbs emitted a sterile, high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate directly behind my eyes. 10 of us sat around the massive oak conference table in the executive suite. The air was suffocatingly dry, smelling of heavily starched shirts, expensive leather portfolios, and the sharp, acidic tang of Arthur's peppermint breath mints. My palms left damp prints on the smooth surface of my printed notes. Beside me, Arthur shifted in his leather chair. It squeaked loudly, a sound that made the lead architect from Peterson Holdings, a severe-looking woman named Beatrice, with a sharp bob and tortoise-shell glasses, glance up from her tablet. Saw moving on to the structural review of the third-floor atrium. Arthur announced, his voice booming with forced confidence. He turned his head, his pale eyes locking onto mine. "Miss Rogers will walk us through the reinforcement strategy." Every head in the room swiveled toward me. Panic, old and deeply ingrained, flared in my chest. In my previous life, a boardroom of this caliber was an execution chamber. I remembered the burning shame of standing in this exact room months later, stammering through excuses while Beatrice dismantled my career with cold surgical precision. My throat closed up tight and dry, fingers trembling slightly. I pushed my chair back and stood. The fabric of my trousers caught against my damp skin. I picked up the heavy brass laser pointer from the table, rolling it between my thumb and forefinger to ground myself in its cool, solid weight. "Good morning," I said. My voice was a fraction too quiet. I paused, swallowed the lump of fear, and forced volume into my chest. If you look at page 4 of the revised schematics, you'll see a deviation from the original draft regarding the load-bearing columns on the south axis. Clicking the remote, the projector transitioned to the Zoomidin CAD file. The red dot of the laser trembled for a microsecond before I locked my wrist, holding it steady over the intersection of steel and glass. The initial calculations underestimated the wind shear stress by a margin of 5 inches. I continued listening to the strange, detached professionalism in my own voice, given the settling rate of the foundation on this specific soil grade. That discrepancy would have resulted in micro fractures along the tempered glass within 14 months. Silence blanketed the room. It wasn't the silence of polite attention. It was the heavy, suspended quiet of multi-million-dollar panic. Beatrice leaned forward, her elbows resting on the oak table. She tapped a manicured fingernail against her tablet screen. The sharp clack, clack, clack echoed in the quiet room. A Halfin discrepancy, and your senior engineers missed this. Her gaze cut past me, aiming directly at Arthur. Arthur's jaw tightened. It was an oversight in the preliminary software modeling. Miss Rogers caught it during a manual review. How exactly did you catch it, Miss Rogers? Beatrice asked, her dark eyes narrowing as she scrutinized me. That's a complex stress calculation for a junior drafter to flag. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. I couldn't tell her I knew about the flaw because I had watched the glass spiderweb and shatter in my nightmares for a decade. I couldn't tell her I knew the exact calculation because it was the math that had ruined my life. I prefer to verify the software outputs manually on high liability stress points. I lied, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. The numbers felt overly optimistic regarding the glass tensile strength. I ran the physical equations and found the gap. Beatrice stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The projector fan wheezed in the background. Finally, the severe line of her mouth softened into a microscopic nod. Thorough. I appreciate that. Walk us through the reinforcement solution. For the next 40 minutes, I didn't think about Clifford. I didn't think about dying in a sterile hospital bed. I let the numbers take over. The complex geometry of weight, steel, and gravity became a shield. By the time I clicked off the projector, my shirt was clinging to my back with nervous sweat, but my lungs felt expansive, taking in full, deep breaths. Excellent work, Miss Rogers, Beatrice said as she gathered her tablet. It was the architectural equivalent of a standing ovation. People began filtering out of the room, the tension evaporating into low murmurs of casual conversation. I stayed behind, methodically gathering my printed notes. Nevire walked up to the edge of the table. She had been sitting in the corner, taking the minutes, practically invisible for the last hour. Her face was pale, the perfect pink blush on her cheeks, standing out in stark, unnatural contrast. That was impressive, she said. The compliment sounded like it had to be dragged out of her throat with pliers. She gripped her clipboard so tightly her knuckles were white. Thanks, I muttered, not looking up as I stacked my papers. I just didn't know you were doing extra manual calculations. She pressed her voice, dropping into that familiar, cloying tone of fake intimacy. You've been so distracted lately with Clifford. I mean, you didn't even mention you were doing this. Stopping my movements, I finally looked up at her. The scent of her vanilla perfume mixed with the nervous, sour smell of her sweat made my stomach turn. She was fishing. She wanted to know how I had magically bypassed her sabotage, how I had stepped out of the neat, pathetic little box she had constructed for me. I don't mention a lot of things. Any, I said evenly. I picked up my stack of papers and tapped them against the table to align the edges. My work doesn't revolve around Clifford. Neither does my life. Her lips parted, a flash of genuine panic crossing her eyes. She hated this. She hated not knowing the plot. Right, she stammered, stepping back as if I had physically pushed her. Of course, walking past her. I left the boardroom. The victory wasn't a soaring cinematic high. It was a heavy, exhausting realization that I was entirely capable of surviving without the people I used to think I needed. Street lamps flickered to life against a backdrop of bruised purple twilight. The city was transitioning from the frantic rush of corporate hours to the desperate seeking energy of Friday night. Exhaustion gnawed at my bones, a deep, physical ache radiating from my lower back all the way up to my skull. Pushing open the heavy brass-handled door of O'Reilly's, a wave of humid air washed over me. The pub smelled of stale beer, damp wood, and cheap fried food. It was dark, the only light coming from the glowing amber bottles behind the bar and a neon beer sign buzzing furiously in the corner window. Sliding onto a sticky leather stool at the far end of the bar, I dropped my bag onto the floor, gin and tonic, heavy on the lime. I told the bartender, a grizzled man who didn't bother making eye contact as he grabbed a glass. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, a dull vibration against my ribs. I pulled it out and stared at the cracked screen. 3 missed calls from Clifford. 2 text messages. Clifford, we need to talk about the lease. You can't just kick me out and expect me to keep paying half. Clifford, answer me. Hannah, this isn't a game. I locked the screen and set the phone face down on the damp wood of the bar. It wasn't a game. It was an eviction. He hadn't paid his half of the rent on time in 6 months anyway. Taking his name off the lease would be a financial relief, not a burden. The bartender set my drink down on a flimsy square napkin. Condensation immediately began to bead on the outside of the glass. I took a sip. The cheap gin burned the back of my throat, harsh and entirely grounding. Hannah! The voice was breathless, cutting through the low hum of the bar. I didn't turn around immediately. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the annoyance wash over me before turning my head. Nev stood a few feet away, clutching her expensive leather purse to her chest. She was wearing a trench coat tied tightly at the waist, looking entirely out of place in the dingy dive bar. She hadn't followed me here by accident. What a coincidence, she said, plastering a wide, sympathetic smile on her face as she slid onto the empty stool next to mine. I was just walking to the subway and saw you come in. You looked so drained after the pitch. I thought you might need some company. She signaled the bartender and ordered a vodka soda. Settling in, her vanilla perfume immediately started wearing with the smell of stale beer. I am just having one drink. And I said, my tone flat, discouraging any further conversation. She ignored the cue, leaning in closer, her eyes wide with manufactured concern. I know you said you were fine at the office, but it's just me here. You can drop the act. Clifford texted me. My fingers tightened around my glass. The ice clinked softly against the rim. Did he? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He's a mess. Hannah, she whispered, leaning so close I could see the tiny pores beneath her foundation. He said you boxed up all his things and practically threw him out. He's staying on his friend's couch. He doesn't understand what happened to you. And honestly, neither do I. You're acting so cold. She took a sip of her drink, watching me over the rim of the glass, waiting for the dam to break. In my previous life, this was the exact moment I would have cracked. I would have spilled my insecurities, admitted my terror of being alone, and begged her for advice on how to fix it. I would have handed her all the ammunition she needed. Instead, I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the slight tension in her jaw, the eager, hungry glint in her eyes. She wasn't an empathetic friend. She was a vulture circling a carcass. What exactly did he tell you, Nevada? I asked quietly, turning my body slightly to face her. She sighed, a dramatic, breathy sound, and placed her hand over mine on the bar. Her skin was freezing. He just feels like you gave up without a fight. He said he asked for space, not a permanent eviction. He thinks you're having some kind of mental breakdown. I pulled my hand out from under hers, picking up a cocktail napkin and methodically wiping the condensation off the bar top. He asked for space in a diner while eating a plate of fries. I corrected my voice, dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. He wanted to break up. I agreed. He's angry because I didn't beg him to stay. He wanted to keep me on a shelf, an option he could pull down when his new life got lonely. Nevi blinked clearly, thrown by my clinical assessment. Hannah, you're being so cynical. For years of history, you can't just erase that. He loves you. If he loved me, he wouldn't be texting my coworker to complain about me. I countered, locking eyes with her. A tiny involuntary muscle spasm twitched beneath her left eye. She recovered quickly, but I saw the panic. I'm your best friend. She defended her voice, pitching slightly higher. He knows I care about you. He was just looking for insight. Insight, I repeated. I took a slow drink of my gin, letting the burn settle in my chest. Like the insight you gave him last month when you told him I was holding him back from his brewery idea, or the insight last week when you suggested I was too focused on my career to be a supportive partner. The color drained completely from Na's face. She looked like she had just been slapped. Her mouth closed, and opened again, but no sound came out. I don't know what you're talking about, she finally stammered, her hands gripping the edge of the bar tightly. I know you talked to him. Nah, I said, feeling a strange hollow pity for the woman sitting next to me. I know you've been texting him for months. I know you think you're the cool, rational option compared to me. I don't care. Hannah, you're paranoid. I don't care. I repeated, my voice hard enough to cut glass. I reached into my bag, pulled out a $10 bill, and tossed it onto the damp counter. You can have him. He's broke. He's vain. And he runs at the first sign of inconvenience. You two deserve each other. I picked up my bag and stood. NEA remained frozen on her stool, her eyes wide, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a monster. Don't pretend to be my friend anymore, Nevada, I said, looking down at her. It's exhausting for both of us. Turning my back on her, I walked out of the dim, sour-smelling pub and back into the cool night air. My chest wasn't tight. I wasn't shaking. For the first time in my life, I had walked away from a burning building without checking to see who was inside. Monday arrived carrying the heavy, wet scent of impending thunderstorms and the distinct, bitter aroma of the lobby's over-roasted espresso. The air pressure was low enough to make the joints in my fingers ache, a phantom symptom from a timeline I was desperately trying to overwrite. Stepping out of the elevator onto the 4th floor, the usual chaotic hum of the architectural bullpen felt muted. My desk chair squeaked as I pulled it out. The smooth, cool plastic of my mouse grounded me as I woke up my monitors, and his desk, situated diagonally from mine, was empty. Her computer screen remained black. A single half-dead succulent sat next to her pristine keyboard. She called in sick. A voice muttered. I turned. David, one of the senior drafters, who usually ignored me, was leaning against the edge of my cubicle divider. He held a ceramic mug, the smell of cheap green tea wafting from it. Stomach bug, apparently, though she sounded perfectly fine when she left on Friday. Shame, I said, my voice completely devoid of inflection. I clicked open the Peterson files. Hope she feels better. David lingered for a second, sensing the absolute lack of gossip material before shuffling back to his own station. By noon, Arthur summoned me to his office. The glass walls offered zero privacy, making me acutely aware of the eyes tracking my movement across the gray carpet. Arthur was staring out his window at the slate gray sky, his hands clasped behind his back. The grandfather clock ticked a rhythmic hollow sound. The Peterson reps signed off on the structural revisions this morning, he said without turning around. Good. He finally pivoted, resting his hands flat against the mahogany surface of his desk. His sharp features looked tired, but the usual frenetic tension in his shoulders was gone. Beatrice specifically requested that you remain on the project as the primary structural liaison. She doesn't trust the seniors who missed the fault line. She trusts the junior drafter who caught it. My lungs expanded. The air in the room suddenly felt less stale. In my previous life, I was fired over this project. Now it was becoming the foundation of my career. I'll need access to the level 4 server clearance, I replied, meeting his pale eyes and a 15% bump in my base salary to reflect the added liability of acting as a primary liaison. Arthur's eyebrows twitched upward. It was a microscopic movement, but it spoke volumes. He wasn't used to junior staff making demands, let alone with such detached clinical precision. He studied my face, looking for the nervous hesitation that used to define me. 10%, he countered, his voice growly, and you report directly to me, bypassing David. Deal. I walked out of his office with a promotion that didn't make me want to cry with relief, but rather felt like a mathematically correct equation finally balancing out. The high didn't last. Reality, ugly and persistent, was waiting for me at the bottom of the building, stepping through the revolving doors into the muggy evening air. The first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the pavement, releasing the sharp smell of wet concrete. Clifford was huddled under the canvas awning of the corner deli. He looked terrible. He wore the same green flannel shirt from the diner, but it was wrinkled, now smelling strongly of stale cigarette smoke and unwashed hair. He hadn't shaved in days. When he spotted me, he pushed off the brick wall and jogged over, stepping directly into my path. Hannah, please just stop for a minute. I halted, pulling my trench coat tighter around my waist. The rain was picking up, soaking the shoulders of his shirt, plastering the fabric to his skin. What do you want, Clifford? I asked. My voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. It was the tone you use with a stranger asking for directions in a city you don't even live in anymore. I tried to get my name off the lease today, he said, wiping a mixture of rain and sweat from his forehead. His hand was trembling slightly. The landlord said, "We need to sign a mutual release form in person, and my bank account is overdrawn. I can't afford the deposit on a new place." He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. It was the look that used to shatter my resolve. It was the calculated vulnerability he deployed whenever he had pushed me too far, a silent demand for me to fix the mess he had created. "That sounds like a logistical problem," I said, watching a raindrop slide down the bridge of his nose. "We can meet at the leasing office tomorrow at lunch to sign the release." "Hannah, I don't have anywhere to go," he finally shouted, the facade cracking. A few commuters rushing past with umbrellas shot us annoyed glances. "Dave kicked me off his couch this morning because his girlfriend is moving in. I have $50 to my name. You took all the savings." I took my savings. I corrected him, the words sharp and absolute. "The money I earned while you brainstormed in coffee shops for 2 years. The money you were going to sink into a failed brewery." His jaw slacked. "How? How do you know about the brewery? I never told you about that. I only talked to Dave about it." A cold, heavy silence fell between us, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the canvas awning. I had slipped up, pulling a fact from a future that hadn't happened yet. But looking at his pathetic, shivering frame, I realized it didn't matter. He was too self-absorbed to put the puzzle together. Nate told me I lied smoothly, the fabrication tasting like ash on my tongue. She told me everything at the bar on Friday. Clifford physically recoiled. The betrayal hit him hard, twisting his features into a grimace. The one person he thought was on his side had in his mind sold him out. "She's a liar," he stammered, stepping closer, reaching out to grab my upper arm. His fingers dug into the wet fabric of my coat. "Hannah, you can't leave me out here. I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't mean any of it at the diner. Please let me come home. Just for tonight." I looked down at his hand, gripping my arm. The heat of his palm seeped through the damp trench coat. In the old timeline, this touch would have felt like an anchor. Now it felt like a parasite trying to burrow back under my skin. "Let go of me," I said quietly. "Hannah, let go of my arm." "Clifford." The command didn't waver. There was a dangerous hollow echo in my voice that finally broke through his panic. He slowly uncurled his fingers, letting his hand drop to his side. "Meet me at the leasing office tomorrow at noon," I said, stepping around him. "If you don't show up, I'll pay the penalty to break the lease entirely, and you can deal with the eviction on your credit score." I walked toward the subway stairs. I didn't look back to see him standing in the rain. My arm throbbed slightly where he had gripped it, a fading echo of a man who no longer existed in my world. Stripping the faded yellow wallpaper felt like shedding a diseased skin. Saturday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the humid air of the studio. I dug the metal edge of the putty knife under a stubborn seam. Pushing hard, the damp paper gave way with a satisfying tearing sound, revealing the raw, gray plaster beneath. My fingernails were caked with dried paste, and the pungent chemical smell of TSB cleaner burned my nostrils. My muscles ached with a dull, heavy fatigue that felt earned rather than the nervous exhaustion that used to plague me. The apartment was empty. Clifford's remaining boxes were gone. The heavy, suffocating scent of his cedarwood deodorant had finally been scrubbed from the floorboards. In the corner next to the radiator sat a freshly signed lease addendum. He had shown up at the office on Tuesday, dark circles under his eyes, and signed the paper without saying a single word to me. I peeled off another long strip of wallpaper, letting it drop onto the plastic drop-cloth covering the hardwood. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, buzzing against the laminate. I wiped my sweating forehead with the back of my wrist and walked over. A text message glowed on the cracked screen. "Net, hey, I know things got messy, but I miss my friend. Can we get coffee and just talk? No Clifford drama. Promise." I stared at the pixels. The old me, terrified of being perceived as the bad guy, would have typed out a conciliatory response. I would have met her, let her apologize with empty words, and allowed her back into my orbit to avoid the awkwardness at the office. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I pressed the small I in the top corner of the message thread. Block caller. The screen flashed, erasing her from my digital existence. I set the phone down. There was no triumphant swell of music in my head, no dramatic rush of adrenaline. It was just a quiet, necessary pruning of a dead branch. Walking back to the wall, I picked up the paint roller. I dipped it into the tray of stark, clean white paint. The sticky, wet sound of the roller absorbing the liquid filled the quiet room. I pressed it against the plaster, rolling it upward in a smooth, thick line. The heavy white paint obliterated the gray wall, covering the old stains, the scuff marks, and the lingering ghosts of arguments past. As I reached the ceiling, I painted directly over the water stain shaped like a bruised eye. The dark spot vanished entirely beneath the fresh coat. A sudden, sharp tremor ran through my hand. I dropped the roller back into the metal tray with a clatter. I, clear as throat, gripped the edge of the windowsill, my knuckles turning white. My chest tightened, a vicious phantom pang of the cardiac arrest that had killed me in my previous life. My brain flooded with the sensory memory of the sterile hospital room, the beeping monitors, the absolute crushing loneliness of dying at 34 with a heart destroyed by stress and a life wasted on people who drained me dry. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe through my nose. I inhaled the sharp smell of fresh paint and wet plaster. I am 24. I repeated internally the mantra anchoring me to the present. I am alive. I am alone and I am safe. The phantom pain slowly receded, leaving behind a cold sweat on my neck. The trauma of dying wouldn't just vanish because I had traveled back. The scars were still there, invisible but throbbing. The difference was I was no longer actively slicing the wounds open. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. Down in the alleyway, a stray cat was navigating the tops of the dumpsters. The city hummed with its usual brutal, indifferent energy. It didn't care that I had defied the laws of time. It didn't care about Clifford's bruised ego or Neve's petty manipulations. The world just kept turning. I turned back to the room. The single stripe of white paint looked stark and harsh against the ruined plaster. It wasn't beautiful yet. It was going to take hours of manual labor to fix the walls, to sand down the rough edges, and to make the space livable. But it was mine. Every square inch of the ruined plaster, every drop of the cheap paint, every ounce of the silence in the room belonged entirely to me. I picked the roller back up. My hand was completely steady as I pressed it against the wall, dragging a second perfect line of white right next to the first. That brings us to the end of Hannah's journey. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply refuse to play the victim in a game rigged against you. Did Hannah's cold detachment resonate with you? Or do you think Clifford deserved a harsher goodbye? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this story of claiming back your power, hit that like button, share it with a friend who needs a reality check, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, realistic drama. Ring the bell so you never miss a new upload.